Hello and welcome back to Book and Page. We are to Chapter 5 of All Quiet on the Western Front. So, as always, we'll start with a brief summary of what happened in this chapter and then talk about things in a little more depth. Quieter chapter today. We start with Paul and his friends gathered around picking lice off of their shirts. Seems, again, a little uncomfortable for us, especially when one of them jokes about using all of the oil from the dead lice to polish boots. I'm being cool, boo, you do you. And while they're picking lice, they do have the chance to talk, but there seem to be two subjects happening. One, Himmelstas has actually materialized on the front, and Muller is more interested in knowing what everybody plans to do after the war during peace times. I mean, some people are more interested in this conversation than others. It mostly boils down to the fact that a lot of the older soldiers already have families and jobs to return to, or at least they hope to return to, while others discuss the idea of actually staying in the army during peace times, thinking it would be a lot better, basically a free meal ticket without any of the horrible stuff that they've had to go through so far. The conversation is interrupted when Himmelstas himself shows up, and Tejan takes the time to just open up on the man, which apparently he did not expect. Himmelstas ends up leaving, claiming he's going to have Tejan court-martialed, and Kat's pretty sure that might actually happen. Too terribly bad, Muller won't change the conversation topic. He's right back to wondering what everybody's going to do during peacetime. And he, Comrade, and Paul realize that they can't exactly return to school. They make fun of it for a while, and then have to come to the realization that when they signed up at so young an age, they didn't really have any direction they were heading, and they might survive the war, but the world has still been blown to pieces. They can't exactly walk off the 2 years that they've been at war so far. Which is a bit of a hard thing to deal with. And when Himmelstas shows back up with some higher-ups, they're not exactly ready to turn Tejan over. And in fact, Comrade is going to have a pot shot at Himmelstas as well. Time to all go in front of the higher-ups and explain themselves. Thankfully, both Comrade and Paul explain that Tejan has an issue with Himmelstas due to the whole bedwetting punishment. And so both Tejan and Comrade are actually let off fairly lightly with what's called open arrest. Everybody plays cards together for a while, and then Paul and Kat head off to steal themselves a goose. Well, Paul goes over the fence, has a fight with some geese, and gets menaced by a bulldog before finally escaping with one of those geese. He and Kat have a lovely meal, and in fact they even share with Comrade and Tejan in their little makeshift prison. This is a bit of a weird chapter, and most people in reading this the first time is going to pull out the sort of homoerotic subtext of the later part of the chapter when Paul and Kat are cooking the goose and Paul enters this sort of weird reminiscing daydream position where he's not really aware of anything, but he does have some comments like them being comrades, them being brothers, them being closer than lovers. So like that's definitely something I think we're going to have to address, but it's not just the only strange part of this chapter. One, we have to recognize again, we've gone back into that lull in battle, considering the last chapter finished with them barely surviving 2 bombardments in one night, to suddenly start up with them picking lice. It's a bit weird. Everything suddenly seems to have come to a stop, but that's probably, again, how soldiers are seeing it. It's moments of action, and then these moments of inaction, or smaller actions, as it were. Because they're not completely inactive. They are, in fact, doing something very necessary for their comfort and survival, which is delousing themselves. But again, for us, that's probably not what we were expecting to see. We are expecting sort of like the bang, bang, bang thing. You'll notice up to this point, up to the bulldog moment, you're not even aware that these people honestly carry guns with them. It's not until there's this menacing moment with the bulldogs that you're suddenly really thinking about the fact that, like, they were thinking of putting the horses out of their misery, and Kat and Paul were thinking about putting the prior recruit out of misery. You're suddenly aware that, yes, these soldiers do in fact have guns. But even though they do have guns, you're not seeing that military, bang bang, we're constantly shooting people. We literally we're putting some barbed wire up and getting bombed, and suddenly we're here picking lice off of ourselves. But that's the thing about this book. This is not trying to be what we imagine war to be. It is trying to accurately describe being a soldier in the trenches. So there are these downplayed moments that you're not always going to be aware of, where the comradeship is forming not always in battle. It is also these quieter moments of sitting there in a communal way to try and take care of yourselves as much as possible. And that is what is happening here in a way that, like, I don't think most of us would necessarily think of when I say self-care. Self-care nowadays, it's become something very important, especially with those who have physical or mental illnesses that they need to take care of. But it's also become sort of one of those, like, hot button terms for, like, the liberal snowflake type thing. Oh, you're just worried about self-care. You're never going to take care of the community. You're just worried about the South. I've definitely heard that context behind self-care. But this is definitely, like, self-care that goes in that first category of you're in a bad situation of some sort and you need to take care of yourself as much as you can in that situation. So nowadays, physical or mental illness, you're making sure you're taking your medication, you're doing what you can do, while these are soldiers at war. Well, self-care in this moment is not somehow removing themselves from the situation. They don't have that option. They will be court-martialed, and in certain circumstances, you might even just be shot. So, self-care here really is taking the opportunity to delouse. It's not letting yourself go entirely because the situation's so awful. Like, they are doing little things to try and ease up on all of this. So, it's this moment where, like, most of us are probably like, ooh, that's gross. No, this is actually, like, a self-care moment for these men in a situation they have, like, no control over. And you really do get the sense, then, that this helps, but it doesn't solve all of the problems. Because this is a chapter just rife with little confrontations that are not going to have a full and peaceful agreement. This is a chapter that has the confrontation between Tejan and Himmelstas. More so even than when they beat the shit out of Himmelstas, because they're now face to face, they're aware of who the other is, and Tejan is still just letting it rip. But this isn't completely a self-cleansing moment, right? This isn't Tejan going to be able to walk away from this having completely just dealt with that whole bedwetting situation that Himmelstas put him through. Because they're in a situation where healing isn't actually possible. Like, they can practice self-care, but it really is just more self-maintenance as much as you can for the fact that they can't remove themselves from this situation. And most of us recognize that part. If you're in a toxic situation, you can deal with that as well as you can, but you're never going to be able to fully overcome it until you are out of that situation. Because the situation's just going to keep affecting you and affecting you and affecting you. So Tietjen might be able to get some of this off his shoulders when it comes to Himmelstas, but he's in the army, in a terrible situation in which most of the group of friends that he knows reminisce about training as the closest thing to nostalgic that they can think about in war times. And what's really interesting about this, then, is all the other moments of sort of self-care, of confronting an abuser, of making sure you're well fed. All of those other things are framed in, like, morally ambiguous ways. Like, Himmelstas himself is now on the front and is going to face the awful realities of war. But nobody here is willing to treat him like we've seen them treat the younger recruits. They're willing to help the younger recruits out a little more. Like, Paul literally lets one guy sort of semi-hide under him because he's just like, yep, this is what I was like coming into the war. Kat gives a recruit some, like, beef and beans. He says afterwards, next time you'll have to trade for it. But there are these sort of moments of kindness where you recognize these are people who are like you, who didn't deserve to be in this situation, that have been thrust into it. But we're not seeing that at all with Himmelstas. Like, he's been an abuser to this group of people in the past. So they're not about to sympathize with him at all, and will actively reject him in any way that they can. But they can't do it fully because they are in the military, and he is technically, like, a person higher up. So when they do go to this, it's not a full court-martial. Like, this moment of talking in front of the higher-ups is not a full court-martial. They admit to what happened, and one of them is just like, well, why didn't you say anything before? And they're just looking at him like, because there was no point. They weren't going to do anything about it. We just had to deal with it. Which is not really what you constantly want to hear, right? So none of these people have any direct escapes from any of these things. And the best moments and the quiet moments for them are effectively after Paul and Kat have, like, stolen somebody's goose, whacked their dog on the head with the butt end of a pistol, and then eaten this person's goose. Like, it is this morally ambiguous moment of, yes, these people were hungry and suffering, but I'm assuming whoever owns the farmhouse and the animals is in a similar situation. Like, the farmhouse is not that far from the front. So that family, you never get an idea if they're there or not. You think after the animals made so much noise that, like, somebody would come out. But maybe the family also recognizes that, like, it's probably a soldier in the backyard and I don't want to get involved in that. Like, I'm not going to win in that argument the same way that none of these soldiers are going to win the argument completely against the officers. So we're seeing sort of these layers of self-care that often come at the expense of somebody else. Sorry, my cat is here and she is just insistent today. And it is a question of, like, how much of that then is really self-care if it's at the harm of somebody else. Not even going to deal with this. Sorry about that. And I think that's like an uncomfortable question that we don't always want to deal with, because it's a question we're always going to have to ask ourselves. Like, if we're in a toxic situation, how much do we take care of ourselves versus anybody else? If you're in an abusive situation, how much do you take care of yourself versus other people in that abusive situation? And that's never going to have an easy answer to that question. Never going to be an easy answer. Especially if there are multiple people in that situation, and it's a question of, well, why didn't you stand up for me? Why didn't you stop the abuse when you could have? You're not always thinking about the fact that whether or not they could have stopped that abuse. And so when they're all on the same level as each other, Tijin is never asking this question. But what's really interesting, when you look at who shares in the goose, there seems to be some hidden feeling of guilt here. Because they're thinking of sharing the goose with everybody else, but they just end up sharing it with Tijin and Comrade, who are both in open arrest. And that's somebody who is trying to make up for the situation that they're in, that really didn't have a way to stop the situation in the first place. So it's this weird, uncomfortable feeling of these men honestly trying to help each other out and help themselves, but there's always these questions of who they're harming in the process, that making yourself aware of that question, at least, even if you don't know the answer, is always going to complicate things. Because you can cheer them for taking care of themselves and their friends as much as you want, but there's still some uncomfortable truths underneath that says, like, none of these men are perfect. There's moral gray areas, but when you're at war, is it possible to be entirely honorable and still survive? And not go crazy from attempting to take the worst situation that humanity can put you in and your moral high ground and have them, like, coexist. And then there is, again, like I said, that homoerotic feeling towards the end of this chapter, which to a lot of readers is going to read as homoerotic, but to a lot of soldiers is probably not. And I say this because, like I said, these are people who are in the worst situation that humanity can put them in with each other. And it's literally this recognition that they will help each other to survive and move forward and not go crazy, to not go suicidal, anything like that. So to us, it might seem like a very close relationship, and I think culturally we just have this tendency to add sexuality to a very close relationship. And that is not what's happening here. There isn't a sexual aspect to this close relationship. It is literally these men are trying to fight for their lives, and they're helping each other to do that. So it is going to be a very close relationship where you are going to see the worst and probably the best of your comrades in these moments. You're going to see them when they shit themselves, when they can't stop crying, when they yell for their mothers. But you're also going to have opportunities where you see them take care of other people, try to help you survive, give you food or cigarettes in the moment that you most need those things. And that is going to form a bond between these people who are literally fighting for their lives. And what's interesting is this homoerotic subtext of the soldiers at war camaraderie that we see goes back just ages and ages and ages. It goes back to the Iliad by Homer and the question of whether Achilles and Patroclus were comrades in arms or if they were in a relationship. And as I understand ancient Greek male relationships, the younger man is the beloved, the older man is the lover. Patroclus is older there, can't imagine Achilles in the position of the lover, so probably not. But we put this homoerotic subtext here because we don't understand how you can have that close of a relationship without there being a sexual nature to it. Because again, like I said, most of us haven't gone to war. We don't know what it feels like to literally rely on the men on either side of us to help us survive and get out of a situation that is going to actively try and kill us. So it is sort of this weird moment. But Paul also seems to be in a really weird place. There are a couple points throughout this chapter where that storytelling that he's been telling himself is starting to sort of crumble. And he's having this realization that things aren't necessarily going to be instantly okay. Even if the war ended tomorrow, all of this is falling to pieces. He's never going to be able to walk away from the 2 years he's already experienced. Even if, like I said, the war was over. So Paul is having these weird moments where his stories are falling apart and he's seeing everything in this sort of weird little... He's talking about himself as a soldier with the big boots and the belt and the knapsack, the little soldier. It's this weird sort of description where he can't define himself, but he can define people like Kat, who have helped him survive and are going to help him survive through the rest of this. So, like, if that gets you angry, like if you're looking at this and you're like, what is this? This is happening during World War I. This wouldn't be acceptable. It's literally men fighting for their lives. They're going to have close relationships with each other that we're not going to necessarily understand until we're in similar situations. And that just goes back for generations upon generations. But yeah, this was a bit of a weird chapter with its confrontations, its self-care that we don't really understand, and this relationship between Kat and Paul that is definitely like, you gotta think about it, right? And think about it in the context that these two men are in. But I'm enjoying myself in taking a deeper look at these things. It is not a comfortable book to read. It's not a happy-go-lucky, man, I enjoyed that adventure, enjoying myself type thing. It is trying to see from a viewpoint that I haven't previously experienced. So I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.